بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا ومولانا محمدا عبده ورسوله إن الله والملائكة يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. First and foremost, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here today, this being the third and culmination of the series of Aqidah that we've actually carried out this year for the benefit of the brothers and sisters within London and also online. The Prophet ﷺ said, Man lam yashkurun nas, lam yashkurullah. Whoever does not thank the people does not thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Secondly, I'd like to thank you all for attending, all the brothers and sisters, and especially so those who are actually listening online from various parts of the world as well. Today, the actual session that we're going to go through is actually quite short, relatively speaking, compared to what we have done through the other two texts, Aqidah Tahawiyah, Aqidah Nasafiyah. So, relatively speaking, it's going to be quite fast-paced, and a lot of quotes are going to be coming through. So today, we're actually going to divide the day into three areas. First and foremost is the issue of al-snad, the chain of transmission, and the significance of the chain of transmission. Second issue would be what is Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and what is the evidence behind it. What is the evidence to state that Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah is the saved sect out of some 73 sects. And finally, the more detailed issue will be about the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how to understand them. Now the first issue that I want to talk about is the issue of al-isnad, the chain of transmission, the importance of al-isnad. What is al-isnad? The isnad is a chain of transmission. How do we understand what is a chain of transmission? Imagine the Quran al-Kareem. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran al-Kareem to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam through a link, through an angel, meaning Jibreel alayhi salam. And then Jibreel brought it down to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam over a certain number of years, some 23 years. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam over those years delivered the Quran, the message, to the Sahaba. And then the Sahaba themselves, a group of them memorized and also wrote the Quran and transmitted it to their students, meaning the generation known as the Tabi'in. These students themselves then transmitted this knowledge of the Quran as well as the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning the hadiths of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to their students. So from the Sahaba down to the Tabi'in, to the Taba Tabi'in, and onwards. This continued, this legacy of transmitting the knowledge, the sources of the Sharia, which is primarily the Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which can itself be broken down into three areas. The Sunnah can be broken down into three areas: the sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and his tacit approvals. And this legacy continued and was transmitted until it had reached us, especially the valid and qualified and recognized pious scholars of this age. So just to give you some information about the isnad, the significance of the isnad according to classical literature, classical quotes, we start from a Sahabi, a famous Sahabi, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, one of the first to embrace Islam. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu stated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that may Allah brighten a man who listened from us something and then passed it on to the others exactly as he heard it, because many a person to whom something is transmitted retains better than the person who first heard it. So this is talking about transmitting the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ consecutively with an unbroken link, an unbroken chain of what's known transmission, al-isnad, or sanad in the singular, asanid in the plural. Imam al-Hakim, one of the later hadith collectors from the 4th century, died around 405 after the Hijrah. He mentions in his book, Ma'rifa Ulum al-Hadith. Ma'rifa Ulum al-Hadith is a book dealing with the subject of what's known as Mustalah al-Hadith, hadith terminology. Imam al-Hakim narrates from Thabit bin Qais that the Prophet ﷺ said to his Sahaba, meaning the companions, you, meaning the Sahaba, are listening and receiving from me, and people, meaning the Tabi'in generation, will listen and receive from you. Then people, meaning the Taba Tabi'in, the third generation, will listen and receive from those, meaning the Tabi'in, the successors, who listen and receive from you. Then people, meaning the fourth generation, will listen and receive from those, meaning the Taba Tabi'in, who were the audience and recipient of the successors who had listened and received from you. So here the Prophet ﷺ himself has foretold, has prophesied that the deen of al-Islam will be transmitted consecutively through what's known as the isnad, the chain of transmission system, which is unique to Islam and not found in any other religion. Later on, the Jews tried to imitate this, especially in Spain. In Andalusia, when the Muslims conquered Spain, the Jews of that territory tried to imitate the chain of transmission. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, one of the great scholars of hadith from the 5th century, died 463 after the Hijrah. He mentions in his book Al-Kifaya, fi ilm al-riwayah, page 121, through Abdullah ibn Umar, one of the Sahaba, radiallahu anh, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, O Ibn Umar, your deen is your faith. Indeed, it is but your flesh and blood, meaning your life. Therefore, you should be very careful about whom you are receiving it from. Receive it from the pious and the steadfast, and do not take it from those who are leaning astray. So here the Prophet ﷺ is also telling us that you should be looking out to take the deen from those who are authorized to transmit the deen with an authentic chain of transmission, going back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ, also going back to the Quran itself. The Quran also has a chain of transmission that only the valid people of knowledge who are experts in tafsir, commentary of the Quran, or experts in tajweed will possess today. Imam Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, one of the Tabi'een, died 181 after the Hijrah. He left a famous statement. Al-snad min ad-din. Al-snad is part of the religion of Islam. And if it was not for the isnad, meaning the chain of transmission, one would have said whatever one desired. When it is said to the one who speaks without an isnad, who informed you, he remains silent and bewildered. So at that time, in the time of the Tabi'een and the Tabi'een, after the civil war, as Ibn Sirin mentions, the civil war, again, what is the civil war? There's discussion amongst the scholars. But after the last of the Sahaba, in the time of the Tabi'een, people of bid'ah, innovation arose, especially when the first sect of Islam arose within Islam called the Khawarij. So the real scholars of Islam, they introduced what's known as the chain of transmission to validate what is authentic knowledge and transmit it consecutively to their very students. So therefore, Ibn al-Mubarak said, he remains silent and bewildered. This is found in the Muqaddimah, the introduction to Sahih Muslim, and Imam al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in his Al-Jami li Akhlaq al-Rawi wa Adab al-Sami'. And Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak also stated, the one who seeks matters of his deen without an isnad, without a chain of transmission, is similar to the one who climbs to the roof without a ladder. So this is all signifying and indicating that if we want to actually get the benefit out of Islam, talking about classical scholarly ilm, knowledge, then we should be taking it from those who have this knowledge transmitted to them with the chains of transmission. Another contemporary of Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak is Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, died 161 after the Hijrah. Imam Sufyan al-Thawri stated that the isnad, the chain of transmission, is the weapon of a believer. When one does not possess a weapon, then with what will he combat? So in that time, those were known as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The way that they validated classical knowledge that they inherited from the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, authoritative knowledge, was to see if it was transmitted with some form of chain of transmission. Once the chain of transmission became apparent, then the scholars, especially the scholars of hadith, will look in and analyze who were the men within each individual chain of transmission to see if the chain of transmission itself was authentic or not. And if the chain of transmission was generally considered to be overall authentic, then the contents that they transmitted, meaning the actual text that they transmitted, would then be accepted or rejected, what's called maqbool, or its opposite, mardud. Imam al-Shafi'i, I'm sure most of us have heard of Imam al-Shafi'i, who died in 204 after the Hijrah. He's on record as saying that the example of the one who seeks hadith, so we're talking about people who want to read hadith today, they want to go out and buy Sahih al-Bukhari in English. What do we advise them? Listen to what the great ones are saying. The example of the one who seeks hadith without an isnad, meaning a chain of transmission, is of a person who gathers wood in the night. He carries a bundle of sticks, not knowing that there is a snake in it. Meaning, he gathers and collects all types of narrations, the genuine and spurious. Unless you're a scholar of hadith, you will not know how to validate these hadiths. Besides the ones in Bukhari and Muslim we're talking about. Al-Imam Abu Hanifa, I'm sure most of us have heard of Abu Hanifa, died in 150 after the Hijrah, as related by Yahya ibn Ma'in. Yahya ibn Ma'in is the greatest scholar of Jar' and Ta'dil, an expert on ilm al-rijal, the narrators within the chains of transmission, an expert on the praiseworthy and unpraiseworthy remarks made on the narrators of hadith. Imam Yahya ibn Ma'in transmits from the authority of Abu Hanifa a statement from Abu Hanifa that's recorded by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in his book Al-Kifaya, page 231. Knowledge should be received only from a transmitter who learns the text by heart and has a deep and perfect understanding of the meanings of what he is transmitting. And that was a scenario in those days. Those people who didn't memorize, they weren't acceptable scholars at that time. Memorization was very important at that time. But later on, people gave up memorizing and started to rely on pen and paper. So Imam Abu Hanifa further stated, as recorded again by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in the same book Al-Kifaya, when someone reads the text in front of a muhaddith, meaning a scholar of hadith, an expert of hadith, or an authority, meaning to get it verified, then he is allowed to transmit from him to others. So this is an important statement. If you want to read Sahih al-Bukhari by yourself, then you're not allowed to act upon those issues pertaining to ijtihad. Where the ruling has to be passed, you have to be careful, keep quiet, let the authorities or the experts decide for us. Other hadiths which encourage one to do good and abstain from evil, then we can act upon those hadiths. But nevertheless, if you want to actually transmit the whole of Sahih al-Bukhari, then you should receive it from one who himself has been authorized to transmit Sahih al-Bukhari with a complete and unbroken chain of transmission going back to al-Imam al-Bukhari. Imam Malik, I'm sure most of us heard of Imam Malik, has also reported, be God-fearing and scrutinize the credibility of the person whom you are receiving this knowledge from. So all of these Imams are from the Salafus Salihin period. Why we're mentioning all of these Imams is because today people claim to be following the way of the Salafus Salihin. And you will find the very same people who claim to follow the way of the Salafus Salihin also belittle the system known as al-Ijaza, getting permit or permission or warrants of authorization to transmit the famous books of hadith with unbroken chains of transmission. So if you really want to be a Salafi, if you really want to be calling yourself Ahlul Hadith, then this is the way. The way that we are quoting from these Imams is the real way of the real Salafi today. The real Salafi today would have these chains of transmission for every major book of Hadith. And we're talking about the scholars. Forget the lay people, we're talking about the scholars. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I'm sure everyone's heard of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, is reported to have said, the Ijazat, if the Ijazat, meaning license of transmission through a chain of authority, was neglected and denied, then the reliable knowledge would be destroyed. This statement is recorded by al-Sakhawi. Imam al-Sakhawi, the student of the great Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, in his book Fathul Mughith, which is a 3-volume work on Mustalah al-Hadith, the principles about the science of Hadith. Now Imam al-Zuhri, Imam Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri said, is the roof raised without the use of a ladder? Meaning the chains of transmission, the asanid, are the stairs through which we reach the classical texts. Also Ahmad ibn Hanbal said, seeking the high isnad, al-snad al-ali, is a sunnah of our salaf. What does that mean? It doesn't mean a very long chain of transmission. It means looking together, the shortest chain of transmission, going back to the Prophet ﷺ, was the practice of the Salafus Salihin. The shorter the chain of transmission, the closer you are to the Prophet ﷺ. So this was a sunnah of the Salafus Salihin. So if you want to imitate that sunnah today, then you should be getting knowledge from those who have the chains of transmission, and that will make you a real Salafi, inshallah. Not just by name, by your actions as well. Because to get the chains of transmission, you've got to seek out those people who have the chains of transmission. If you look at the way, the example of the Salafus Salihin, they would travel vast distances just to hear one hadith. We named Yahya ibn Ma'in. If you know his background, he inherited a great fortune from his father. By the time he was about to pass away, he had nothing left. Nothing left, and we'll quote something from him which is very important to show how they were affixed to the way of gathering hadiths and had no connection to the dunya. Imam Ahmad, we mentioned, Shaykh Muhammad bin Aslam at-Tusi, rahimahullah, once said, closeness to isnad is closeness to Allah, for without doubt, closeness to our Apostle sallallahu alaihi wasallam is closeness to Allah. This is reported again by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in his book Al-Jami' li-Akhlaq al-Rawi wa Adab al-Sami'. Shaykh Ibn Rahmun, rahimahullah, said, seeking ijaza, meaning permission, in the past and present was amongst the sunnah of the ulama of hadith. So not just the past, but also the present. So you'll find the famous institutes which teach hadith today, especially in the Indian subcontinent, all of them, they will have the chain of transmission going back to the 6 books of hadith. If they lacked that, then they wouldn't be given recognition. This is a tradition which is ongoing in the Indian subcontinent thanks to the efforts of Shah Waliullah from more than 200 years ago. If you go to the Arab lands, this tradition doesn't really exist in the established institutes. You'll have to go and find scholars and sit with them and then get permission to transmit their chains of authority. Shaykh Ibn Rahmoon said, seeking Ijaza in the past and present was amongst the sunnah of the ulama of hadith in order to preserve the tradition of isnad and in turn the sharia. However, it has been forgotten in these times. And Ijaza and sanad have been neglected because scholars thought that knowledge was only in teaching and being outstanding. So this is a modern phenomenon that we're seeing, especially after the demise of the last Caliphate. When the new institutes are formed, which actually have syllabuses which imitate the Western syllabi, then you will see that they've actually destroyed the way of the Salafus Salihin, the actual transmission of knowledge using the chains of transmission and validation, what's called al-Ijaza. Ijaza itself, there are 8 types of Ijaza, which we'll mention soon, inshallah. Imam Abu Nasr Ahmed ibn Nasr al-Faqih, rahimahullah, once said, there is nothing harder upon the people of ilhad, meaning deviation, meaning the deviants out there, nor more despised by them than hearing hadith and its narration with isnad. So you find these people today, they call themselves Salafi, left, right and center, willy-nilly everywhere. You go any Muslim land today, there's many people calling themselves Salafi. To really check if they're Salafi, talk about these issues about the isnad and see how many of them have the isnad, how many actually received the famous books of hadith with al-isnad, the chain of transmission, going back to them, unbroken links back to the likes of Bukhari and onwards to the Prophet ﷺ and so on. Yahya ibn Ma'in is on record as saying, while he was suffering in his last illness before his death, someone asked him, what do you desire? You're about to pass away. What do you desire? What do you want to leave behind? What legacy, what inheritance do you want to leave behind to the people of the age? He answered, an empty house and a high isnad. Al-isnad al-ali wa baytul khali. It even rhymes. A very high chain of transmission going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and an empty house, meaning no material possessions for anyone to benefit from, except the chain of transmission which will benefit you in the terms of getting knowledge that can be transmitted onwards as well. Imam Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi from the 6th century, the one who wrote a commentary to Tirmizi called Aridatul Ahwazi, and he also has a tafsir. Imam Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, not to be confused with Muhyiddin ibn Arabi as-Sufi. Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi is the student of the famous Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, died in 543, Imam ibn al-Arabi. He's on record as saying that Allah has honored this nation, meaning the Ummah of Muhammad, with the isnad which he did not give to anyone else. So beware of following the way of the Jews and the Christians. Will you narrate without isnad and thus remove Allah's blessings from yourselves, opening yourselves to attack and seeking to keep your position whilst you are partners with the people whom Allah has cursed and is angry with and following their way? This is reported by the great scholar of hadith, Shaykh Abdul Hayy al-Kattani, who was known as Hafiz of Hadith, who passed away in the early 60s, in his book Al-Fihris al-Faharis, volume 1, page 80. So Abdul Hayy al-Kattani, who was also known as the Musnid of the time, the one who had the most chains of transmission in his age, he died in exile in France. He was from Morocco, Fez originally. He's on record as saying, the higher the isnad of a narrator, the closer they are to Allah's Apostle sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now we'll conclude with this section with one hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that this knowledge will be carried by the trustworthy ones of every generation. They will expel from it the alteration made by those going beyond bounds, false claims of the liars, and the false interpretations of the ignorant ones. This is related by Imam al-Bayhaqi in his book Al-Sunan al-Kubra, volume 10, page 209, Ibn Abi Hatim in his book Al-Jarh wa Ta'adil, volume 2, page 17, Ibn Abdul Bar in his Tamheed, volume 1, page 57. From the hadith of Ibrahim bin Abdul Rahman al-Udhari, it was authenticated by Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and this is mentioned by Imam al-Khatib al-Baghdadi in his book Sharaf Ashabul Hadith, the nobility of the people of Hadith. So all of these narrations are indicating the importance of transmitting and receiving knowledge with a chain of transmission and seeking out those people, those scholars who have that validation given to them as well. Now, what are the methods of carrying and imparting hadith? What's called tahammul al-hadith. Then there are 8 methods. First, what's known as as-sama'. As-sama' means in this method, a student he receives hadith or any form of knowledge. It could be the Quran, the tafsir of Quran, or it could be Arabic language text, it could be poetry, and so on. In the method, a student receives hadith from the mouth of his teacher, his shaykh, regardless of whether the shaykh is speaking from memory or reading from a book. It doesn't have to be from memory directly. The process can take the form of dictation or otherwise. The knowledge acquired through this method is preferably referred to in transmission by such terms as sami'tu, I heard, or haddathana. Al-qira'ah, this is the opposite of sama', in which a student reads under his shaykh from a book or recites from memory, and the latter listens or compares the former's reading with his own copy. The suggested words for the transmission of hadith by this means are qara'tu ala or akhbarana. This method is also known as ard, presentation, because the student presents the material to his shaykh, his teacher. The third one, al-ijaza. In ijaza, a scholar gives authorization to a student to transmit a text, a specific text. This method does not imply any form of reading. No reading is required for attaining ijaza. Suggested words for the transmission material received by this means are ajazani or anba'ana. These are very technical terms, but I'll give you an indication where to get more on this soon, inshallah. Al-munawala, in this method, a teacher hands over written material to his student with or without the permission to transmit it to others. The teacher may ask the student either to retain that copy or to transcribe it and return it, the original, back to him. The recipient uses the term nawalani or akhbarana or munawalatan in referring to such material. The fifth one, al-mukataba. In this method, a shaykh sends, as opposed to hands to his student, either material, either writes in his own hand or written for him by someone else. This material may or may not be accompanied by an ijaza to transmit it further. The recipient uses the terms katabu ilayya. The sixth one, al-i'lam. In this method, a shaykh informs his student that such and such material belongs to him. To many scholars, the student is not entitled to transmit the material until he is given the consent of his shaykh. He uses the terms alamani or akhbarani bil-i'lam. The seventh, al-wasiyah, is this method. In this method, the shaykh bequeaths his material to somebody by will, like inheritance, being either at the point of death or about to undertake a journey, with or without the authorization to transmit it. The terms used to refer to such material are called akhbarani wasiyatan. And the final one, the eighth type of transmission, is al-wijada. This refers to the discovery of some material regardless of whether it belongs to a contemporary scholar or someone earlier. The terms used in transmitting this material are wajadtu or ukhbirtu wijadatan. And these are the 8 types of valid ways of transmitting classical knowledge, especially hadith books. So the meaning of ijaza, what is it? Meaning of ijaza, technically this is permission to transmit orally or in writing. According to the muhaddithin, the traditionists, ijaza means a license given by a shaykh to a transmitter, authorizing the latter to transmit a text or a whole book. And that could involve, without involving direct study of the text as well. In his turn, the shaykh writes this permission in his own hand, or someone else writes it on his behalf, or he declares it orally, or sends it in a form of a letter. So there are 4 elements of ijaza. The person who's the teacher who transmits the ijaza is called a mujiz. One who sanctions an ijaza is called a mujiz. The one who is a transmitter who receives, mujaz lahu. The material that's been transmitted is called mujaz bihi, and the wording that is transmitted is called lafz al-ijaza. Now all of this I've rushed through in a way. If you want greater detail, you can find online a PDF of the work, the Muqaddimah of Imam Ibn Salah, which is about 300 pages. I'm talking about the English edition, English translation. There's a great a detailed section on all of this that I've just spoken about, the ijaza, the 8 types of ijaza, which you can read in your own time. Just to give you some additional information, we have been studying the Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah in private lessons, and we have covered about 60 pages out of 300, and all of it's been recorded. So in the near future, they will be uploaded through Tahqiq.com, so you can catch up on my commentary on all of this further according to the interpretation given by the great Imam Ibn Salah al-Shahrazuri.